Reading from paulgraham.com, How to Come Up with Startup Ideas, Part 2. The clash of domains is a particularly fruitful source of ideas. If you know a lot about programming and you start learning about some other field, you'll probably see problems that software could solve. In fact, you're doubly likely to find good problems in another domain because A, the inhabitants of that domain are not as likely as software people to have already solved their problems with software, and B, since you come into this new domain totally ignorant, you don't even know what the status quo is to take for granted. Competition. Because a good idea should seem obvious, when you have one, you'll tend to feel that you're late. Don't let that deter you. Worrying that you're late is one of the signs of a good idea. 10 minutes of searching the web will usually settle the question. Even if you find someone else working on the same thing, you're probably not too late. It's exceptionally rare for startups to be killed by competitors, so rare that you can almost discount the possibility. So unless you discover a competitor with the sort of lock-in that would prevent users from choosing you, don't discard the idea. Err on the side of doing things where you'll face competitors. Inexperienced founders usually give competitors more credit than they deserve. Whether you succeed depends far more on you than on your competitors. So better a good idea with competitors than a bad one without. A crowded market is actually a good sign because it means both that there is demand and that none of the existing solutions are good enough. A startup can't hope to enter a market that's obviously big and yet in which they have no competitors. So any startup that succeeds is either going to be entering a market with existing competitors, be armed with some secret weapon that will get them all the users, or entering a market that looks small but which will turn out to be big. Filters. There are two more filters you'll need to turn off if you want to notice startup ideas: the unsexy filter and the scalp filter. Scalp. Most programmers wish they could start a startup by just writing some brilliant code, pushing it to a server, and having users pay them lots of money. They prefer not to deal with tedious problems or get involved in messy ways with the real world, which is a reasonable preference because such things slow you down. But this preference is so widespread that the space of convenient startup ideas has been stripped pretty clean. If you let your mind wander a few blocks down the street to a messy, tedious ideas, you'll find valuable ones just sitting there waiting to be implemented. The shelf filter is so dangerous that I wrote a separate essay about the condition it induces. I gave Stripe as an example of a startup idea that benefited from turning off this filter, and a pretty striking example. Thousands of programmers were in a position to see this idea. Thousands of programmers knew how painful it was to process payments before Stripe, but when they looked for startup ideas, they didn't see this one because unconsciously they shrank from having to deal with payments. And dealing with payments is a shout for Stripe, but not an intolerable one. In fact, they might have had net less pain because the fear of dealing with payments kept most users away from this idea. Stripe has had uh, comparably smooth sailing in other areas that are sometimes painful, like user acquisition. They didn't have to try very hard to make themselves heard by users because users were desperately waiting for what they were building. The unsexy filter is similar to the shelf filter, except it keeps you from working on problems you despise rather than the ones you fear. Turning off the shelf filter is more important than turning off the unsexy filter because the shelf filter is more likely to be an illusion. And even to the degree it isn't, it's worse form of self-indulgence. Starting a successful startup is going to be fairly laborious no matter what. Even if the product doesn't entail a lot of shelves, you still have plenty dealing with investors, hiring and firing people, and so on. So if there's some idea you think would be cool, but you kept away from by fear of the shelves involved, don't worry. Any sufficiently good idea will have as many recipes. While the best way to discover startup ideas is to become the sort of person who has them and then build whatever interests you, sometimes you don't have that luxury. Sometimes you need an idea now. For example, if you're working on a startup and your initial idea turns out to be bad. For the rest of this essay, I'll talk about tricks for coming up with startup ideas on demand. Although empirically you're better off using the organic strategy, you could succeed this way. You just have to be more disciplined. When you use the organic method, you don't even notice the ideas unless it's evidence that something is truly missing. But when you make a conscious effort to think of startup ideas, you have to replace this natural constraint with self discipline. You'll see a lot more ideas, more of them, most of them bad, so you need to be able to filter them. Organic ideas feel like inspirations. There are a lot of stories about successful startups that began when the founders had what seemed a crazy idea but just knew it was promising. When you feel that about an idea you've had while trying to come up with ideas, you're probably mistaken. When searching for ideas, look in areas where you have some expertise. If you're a database expert, don't build a chat app for teenagers, unless you're a teenager. Maybe it's a good idea, but you can't trust your judgment about that, so ignore it. There have to be other ideas that involve databases and whose quality you can judge. Do you find it hard to come up with good ideas involving databases? That's because your expertise raises your standards. Your ideas about chat apps are just as bad, but you're giving yourself the Dunning-Kruger pass in that domain. The place to start looking for ideas is things you need. There must be things you need. If you're changing ideas, one unusual thing about you is the idea you had previously been working on. Did you discover any needs while working on it? Several well-known startups began this way. Hotmail began as something its founders wrote to talk about their previous startup idea while they're working at their day jobs. One way to ensure you do a good job solving other people's problems is to make them your own. When Rajat Suri of Elacarte decided to write software for restaurants, he got a job as a waiter to learn how restaurants work. That may seem like taking things to extremes, but startups are extremes. In fact, one strategy I recommend to people who need a new idea is to merely turn off their shelf and unsexy filters, but to seek out ideas that are unsexy and involve shelves. Don't try to start Twitter. Those ideas are so rare that you can't find them by looking for them. Make something unsexy that people will pay you for. A good trick for bypassing the shelf and to some extent the unsexy filter is to ask what you wish someone else would build so that you could use it. What would you pay for right now? But imagine asking that in the future, not now. When one company or industry replaces another, it usually comes in from the side. So don't look for replacement for X. Look for something that people will later say turned out to be a replacement for X. And be imaginative about the axis along which the replacement occurs. Traditional journalism, for example, is a way for readers to get information and to kill time, a way for writers to make money and to get attention, and a vehicle for several different types of advertising. It could be replaced on any of these axes. Similarly, since the most successful startups generally ride some wave bigger than themselves, it could be a good trick to look for waves and ask how one could benefit from them. The prices of gene sequencing and 3D printing are both experiencing more slow-like declines. What's new? What new things we'll be able to do in new world we'll have in a few years? What are we unconsciously ruling out as impossible that will soon be possible? Organic. But talking about looking explicitly for ways that make it clear that such recipes are plan B for getting startup ideas. Looking for waves is essentially a way to simulate the organic method. If you are at the leading edge of some rapidly changing field, you don't have to look for waves, you are the wave. Finding startup ideas is a subtle business, and that's why most people who try fail miserably. It doesn't work well simply to try to think of startup ideas. If you do that, you get bad ones that sound dangerously plausible. The best approach is more indirect. If you have the right sort of background, good startup ideas will seem obvious to you. But even then, not immediately. It takes time to come across situations where you notice something missing. And often these gaps won't seem to be ideas for companies, just things about things that would be interesting to build. Which is why it's good to have the time and the inclination to build things that just because they're interesting. Live in the future and build what seems interesting. Strange as it sounds, that's the real recipe.